Look at any family photograph taken in the 20th century. The birthdays, the weddings, the first steps on the moon. Chances are, one single company captured them all. At its absolute peak, the Eastman Kodak Company did not just dominate the market. They owned human memory. They controlled 90% of the American film industry. They built a massive, self-sustaining city in Rochester, New York, spanning over 1,000 acres. Building-sized machines ran 24 hours a day, generating billions in pure profit. Then, the machines went dead. The towering brick factories were wired with explosives and turned to ash. The untouchable empire evaporated into a $7 billion bankruptcy crater, destroyed by the exact digital technology they invented in their own laboratories. How does a monopoly that captured the entire world completely erase its own future? Chapter 1. The Dawn of an Era. In the late 1870s, photography was not an art for the masses. It was a grueling physical labor reserved for professionals and wealthy eccentrics. If you wanted to take a picture, you did not just carry a camera. You hauled a massive wooden box, a heavy tripod, fragile glass plates, and a portable darkroom tent filled with toxic, foul-smelling chemicals. You had to coat the glass with wet emulsion, expose it while still damp, and develop it immediately in the field. One mistake, one slip of the hand, and the image vanished. The process demanded patience, money, and a remarkably strong back. George Eastman had none of those things. He was a junior clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank in New York. He lived a quiet, deeply predictable life, trapped behind a desk counting other people's money. But Eastman harbored an absolute obsession. He loved photography, yet he hated the sheer physical burden of the equipment. He looked at the heavy glass plates and the messy chemicals and saw a fundamental flaw in the industry. He believed taking a picture should be as simple as writing a sentence. Most men would have accepted the harsh limitations of their time. Eastman decided to dismantle them completely. He transformed his mother's kitchen into a makeshift laboratory. During the day, he worked his shift at the bank. At night, he mixed hot gelatin and silver bromide over the stove, searching for a way to coat photographic plates so they could be used dry. He ruined cooking pots, stained the wooden floors, and barely slept. After 3 years of relentless, exhausting experimentation, he cracked the code. He patented a machine for coating dry plates and started a small manufacturing business. But dry glass was still glass. It was heavy, and it shattered easily. Eastman knew he had to eliminate the glass entirely if he wanted to reach everyday people. He needed a flexible surface. He and his small team experimented with paper coated in photographic emulsion, eventually moving to a revolutionary material called transparent celluloid film. They rolled it onto a tight spool. This single invention, flexible roll film, changed the trajectory of human history. It removed the weight, the extreme fragility, and the toxic chemical mess from the photographer's hands forever. In 1888, Eastman introduced a machine that would weaponize this new film. He called it the Kodak. The name meant absolutely nothing in any language. He invented the word because it was short, vigorous, and impossible to mispronounce. The Kodak? No. One was a simple rectangular box loaded with enough film for 100 exposures. It cost $25. It featured no focus ring, no shutter speed dials, and no complex settings. You pointed the wooden box, pulled a string to set the shutter, and pressed a single button. That was the entire process. When the roll was finished, the customer did not develop the film themselves. They mailed the entire camera back to the factory in Rochester. For $10, Eastman's workers extracted the film, developed the negatives, printed the pictures, loaded a fresh roll into the camera, and shipped everything back to the customer. To sell this radical concept, Eastman coined a slogan that would echo across the next century. You press the button, we do the rest. The impact hit the world like a massive shockwave. Before the Kodak, people only had their portraits taken a few times in their entire lives, usually sitting frozen in stiff, formal studios. Suddenly, ordinary people could freeze time themselves. They photographed their children playing in the yard, their dogs running across the grass, their vacations at the beach. Photography stepped out of the darkroom and crashed into daily life. Eastman did not just invent a camera. He invented the snapshot. He found a way to monetize human memory. By simplifying the process, he unlocked a colossal, previously untapped market. The demand exploded instantly. The Kodak No, one sold by the tens of thousands. Orders flooded into Rochester from every corner of the globe. The factory scrambled to keep up with the overwhelming rush of customers desperate to document their own existence. A bored bank clerk from upstate New York had democratized the visual world. He turned a complicated chemical science into a highly profitable, accessible consumer product. Eastman captured the global market almost overnight, setting the concrete foundation for an industrial giant that would rule undisputed for the next 100 years. The dawn of the Kodak era had broken, and the empire was ready to conquer. Chapter 2. The Rochester Money Machine. George Eastman did not just want to sell cameras. He wanted to own the entire process of photography. He understood a fundamental rule of commerce long before his competitors. The real money was not in the machine. The real money was in the supplies. Eastman adopted a ruthless, highly effective strategy. He sold the Kodak cameras at a razor-thin profit margin. Sometimes, he even pushed them out the door at a loss. He wanted a camera in every hand, in every home, in every country. Once a customer bought the camera, they entered an ecosystem they could never leave. They needed film. They needed toxic developing chemicals. They needed specialized printing paper. And Eastman made absolutely sure his company controlled every single step of that supply chain. To feed this endless, exploding global demand, Eastman built a fortress. He bought 16 acres of farmland in Rochester, New York, and started pouring concrete. He called it Kodak Park. It was not a park. It was a terrifying industrial juggernaut. Over the decades, it swallowed the surrounding landscape, expanding into a massive complex spanning over 1,000 acres. It contained more than 150 manufacturing buildings. It became a self-sustaining city within a city. Kodak Park generated its own electricity. It operated its own massive water treatment plant. It ran its own fire department and deployed its own private police force. A dedicated railroad network snaked through the complex, moving raw materials in and hauling finished products out to the world. The scale of production inside those walls defied human logic. The factory consumed raw materials at a staggering, relentless rate. Silver formed the beating heart of the photographic process. Kodak bought silver bars by the ton, eventually becoming one of the largest consumers of raw silver on the entire planet. Inside the heavily guarded buildings, workers melted the silver, treated it with harsh acids, and turned it into the light-sensitive emulsion that coated the film. They operated massive, building-sized coating machines in absolute, pitch-black darkness. These machines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause. They churned out millions of miles of celluloid film. The factory never slept. It hummed with the constant, deafening mechanical rhythm of creation. Rochester transformed into the image city. The local economy bound itself entirely to Eastman's vision. Generations of families worked inside the towering walls of Kodak Park. They entered the gates as young men and women and left decades later with solid pensions. Kodak provided good wages, robust health care, and a sense of absolute, unshakable security. The company built theaters, funded schools, and shaped the entire civic life of the region. By the middle of the 20th century, the Eastman Kodak Company stood as an untouchable global titan. The financial numbers told a story of total, suffocating, market domination. Kodak controlled nearly 90% of the photographic film market in the United States. They held 85% of the camera sales. They crushed domestic competitors mercilessly and kept foreign rivals permanently at bay. The striking yellow and red logo became universally recognized. You saw it in pharmacies, corner grocery stores, and dedicated photo kiosks on every main street in America. Kodak dictated the terms of the entire industry. They set the prices. They defined the global standards. Kodak evolved beyond a simple manufacturing entity. They became the official archivist of the human experience. They did not just sell film. they sold memories. When soldiers shipped out to war, they packed Kodak cameras in their bags. When families gathered for holidays, a Kodak flashbulb lit the room. When humanity took its first tentative steps on the moon, Kodak film captured the historic moment. The company embedded itself deeply into the cultural DNA of the world. They convinced billions of people that a moment unrecorded was a moment lost forever, and only Kodak possessed the power to save it. They printed money. The corporate cash reserves swelled into the billions. The leadership executives sat in their Rochester headquarters, looking out over their sprawling, smoke-belching empire, utterly convinced of their own invincibility. They had built the perfect business machine. It consumed raw materials and spat out pure, uninterrupted profit. Nobody could break it. Nobody could challenge it. They owned the present, and they believed, with absolute certainty, they owned the future. Chapter 3. Monopoly Culture and Arrogance. Absolute power poisons the mind. Inside the executive suites at Rochester, success bred a toxic, suffocating arrogance. The men who ran the Eastman Kodak Company did not see themselves as mere businessmen. They saw themselves as industrial royalty. They controlled a global monopoly so complete that the federal government occasionally launched antitrust investigations, only to back away from the sheer, overwhelming complexity of their dominance. Kodak did not compete in the open market. They dictated reality. And when a company stops competing, it stops thinking. The corporate culture calcified rapidly. The once agile company grew thick with bureaucracy and endless layers of middle management. The headquarters turned into a labyrinth of cautious decision-making. If a junior engineer developed a new concept, that idea had to survive a brutal gauntlet of committees, review boards, financial assessments, and executive sign-offs. The approval process dragged on for months, sometimes stretching into years. Innovation suffocated under heavy mountains of paperwork. The leadership heavily rewarded obedience and conformity over wild creativity. They wanted steady, predictable, guaranteed growth. They deeply hated risk. They viewed any disruption to their perfect system as an enemy to be crushed, rather than a tool to be utilized. Inside the massive walls of Kodak Park, a strict, unspoken caste system ruled the hallways. The chemical engineers held absolute, unquestioned power. They wore their white laboratory coats like armor. They understood the complex, microscopic interactions of silver halides, light, and gelatin. They firmly believed photography was, and forever would be, a chemical reaction. They treated anyone who suggested otherwise with open, arrogant contempt. Electrical engineers and early computer scientists existed entirely on the fringes of the company. The chemical kings viewed them as glorified mechanics, perhaps useful for maintaining factory machinery, but completely irrelevant to the core, sacred business of capturing light. This obsessive focus on chemistry blinded them to a rapidly shifting outside world. The decades following the mid-20th century brought the undeniable dawn of the Silicon Age. Transistors shrank in size. Computers grew exponentially stronger. Television beamed instant electronic images directly into millions of living rooms. The writing appeared clearly on the wall for anyone willing to look. The future of visual media belonged to data, not silver and acid. Yet, the Kodak executives actively refused to read the signs. They looked at early electronic imaging technology and laughed out loud. They dismissed it as a cheap, blurry gimmick. They convinced themselves that raw electronic sensors could never replicate the rich depth, perfect color, and infinite resolution of a chemical photograph. Their catastrophic blindness stemmed directly from their massive bank accounts. The brilliant business model had become a deadly trap. Film generated astronomical profit margins. Every single time a customer pressed a shutter button anywhere on Earth, a cash register essentially rang in Rochester. Film cost pennies to manufacture in massive industrial quantities, but it sold for premium dollars. Developing chemicals brought even more reliable cash. Specialized photographic paper sealed the deal. It was a perfect, closed loop of endless, flowing revenue. Why would any sane, highly paid executive fund a new technology that explicitly did not use film. Developing a filmless camera felt like deliberate corporate suicide. It meant aggressively destroying the very product that built their empire. So, they actively chose denial. They built a massive, invisible wall of arrogance around Rochester. The city became a dangerous echo chamber. They told themselves their iconic brand was simply too strong to fail. People trusted the familiar yellow box. People deeply loved the emotional concept of the Kodak moment. The executives sat in their plush offices and convinced each other that consumers would always demand the tactile, physical feel of a printed photograph. They attended global industry conferences, delivered keynote speeches, and patted themselves on the back, completely ignoring the subtle, dangerous tremors shaking the ground beneath their feet. They watched foreign technology companies build electronic televisions and early video cameras, quickly dismissing them as irrelevant novelties that posed no threat to the still image. They firmly believed nobody could ever match their decades of chemical expertise. They were absolutely right about the chemistry. Nobody could beat Kodak at making film. But they completely failed to realize that the fundamental rules of the game were about to change. The world was preparing to stop playing with chemicals entirely. The executives sat high in their corner offices, counting their record-breaking profits, blissfully unaware that they had locked the doors from the inside while a technological fire started in the basement. Chapter 4. The Digital Time Bomb. Deep inside the sprawling research laboratories of Kodak Park in 1975, a quiet revolution began. It did not start with the senior chemical engineers who ruled the company. It started with a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Steve Sasson. Kodak hired Sasson to explore the potential of charge-coupled devices, a new type of electronic sensor. He worked in an obscure, applied research lab, far away from the prestige of the film departments. He received a vague assignment to see if he could build a camera using these new solid-state sensors. Sasson scrounged for parts across the massive facility. He found an old lens from a Super 8 movie camera. He gathered analog to digital converters, half a dozen circuit boards, and a portable cassette tape recorder. He wired everything together into a clunky, bizarre contraption that looked like a mutated toaster. The machine weighed 8 pounds and required a dozen batteries to operate. It contained absolutely no film. In December 1975, Sasson pointed the awkward device at a lab assistant and pressed a button. The machine whirred and clicked. It took 23 torturous seconds to capture the image and record the digital data onto the standard audio cassette tape. To view the result, Sasson had to remove the tape, place it into a custom-built playback device, and display the image on a standard television set. The picture appeared in pure black and white. It held a resolution of just 0.01 megapixels. It was blurry, distorted, and practically unrecognizable by Kodak's elite standards. But it was a photograph taken entirely without chemistry. Sasson knew he had created something profound. He possessed the first digital camera in human history. In the following months, Sasson hauled his heavy invention into a series of conference rooms across the corporate headquarters. He presented his findings to various groups of Kodak executives. He explained the fundamental concept of filmless photography. He demonstrated how the camera captured light electronically and stored it as data. He even accurately predicted that the technology would improve rapidly, estimating it would take 15 to 20 years for digital sensors to compete with chemical film in the consumer market. The executives stared at the blurry image on the television screen. They did not see a technological breakthrough. They saw a terrifying existential threat. The questions they asked Sasson revealed their complete inability to grasp the future. They demanded to know why anyone would ever want to look at their photographs on a television screen. They pointed out the flawless resolution of chemical film compared to the terrible quality of his digital image. But their true fear lay hidden beneath the technical critiques. The executives understood exactly what this machine represented. This clunky device required no silver. It needed no film rolls. It consumed no developing chemicals and used no photographic paper. If this technology succeeded, it would annihilate the highly profitable supply chain that generated billions of dollars for the company. The leadership faced a critical choice. They could embrace the disruption, fund the new technology, and lead the inevitable digital revolution. Or they could protect their current profits and hope the threat simply disappeared. They chose the profits. The executives instructed Sasson to keep his invention quiet. They told him not to tell anyone else about it. They patted the young engineer on the back, filed his report away, and essentially buried the world's first digital camera in a corporate closet. They firmly believed they possessed the power to control the pace of technological change. If Kodak did not sell digital cameras, they reasoned, then the public would never adopt them. This decision stands as one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in modern industrial history. By hiding the invention, they protected their film monopoly for a few more decades. But they surrendered the future entirely. They built the bomb that would eventually destroy their empire, and then they willfully ignored the ticking sound. While the executives in Rochester congratulated themselves on neutralizing the internal threat, tech companies across the ocean began moving. The digital countdown had officially started. Chapter 5: Warning from a Rival. While the executives in Rochester successfully buried the world's first digital camera, a storm gathered across the Pacific Ocean. A completely different business philosophy governed the corporate boardrooms in Japan. Companies like Sony, Canon, and Fuji Photofilm did not suffer from the blinding arrogance that infected Kodak. They looked at the early electronic sensors and saw a massive, undeniable opportunity. They poured billions of yen into aggressive research and development. They fully embraced the digital horizon. But Fuji did not wait for the digital revolution to launch their attack. They decided to bleed the giant in the present. They chose to fight Kodak, using Kodak's own primary weapon. They declared war on the chemical film market. Fuji formulated a ruthless, highly disciplined strategy. They spent years quietly perfecting their chemical formulas. They developed photographic film that rivaled Kodak's legendary quality. They specifically engineered their film to capture incredibly vibrant greens and reds. But product quality alone was not enough to break a monopoly. Fuji needed a tactical advantage. They found it in pricing. They manufactured their film far cheaper than the bloated factories in Rochester ever could. They packed their rolls into bright green boxes and shipped them directly into the United States. They did not launch a global attack immediately. They targeted the American market directly. They walked right into Kodak's most profitable backyard and started placing their green boxes on store shelves right next to the iconic yellow ones. They priced their films significantly lower. The Kodak executives watched the green boxes appear in pharmacies and grocery stores, but they did very little. They firmly believed American consumers possessed absolute, unbreakable loyalty to the hometown brand. They assumed a cheaper price would never break a century of deep cultural habit. When an American family went to the store to buy film for a summer vacation or a child's birthday, the executives assumed they would always reach for the yellow box. They miscalculated completely. Everyday people looked at the prices, saw the massive difference, and chose the green box. The photographs looked just as good. The market share began to slip. It started as a slow bleed, just a few percentage points disappearing from the balance sheets. But in the high-volume game of consumer film, every single percentage point represented millions of dollars in lost revenue. When Kodak finally realized the true severity of the threat, they did not respond by improving their own film. They did not respond by lowering their prices to compete. They responded with armies of corporate lawyers. Kodak lobbied the United States government heavily. They filed massive, complex trade complaints. They publicly accused Fuji of dumping cheap film into the American market to unfairly destroy domestic competition. The legal battles dragged on for years, consuming massive amounts of corporate energy, money, and attention. Kodak fought the war in the courtroom because they had completely forgotten how to fight it in the laboratory. They spent millions on attorneys, while Fuji spent millions on marketing and aggressive product placement. The ultimate, crushing humiliation arrived in 1984. The Olympic Games were coming to Los Angeles. This represented a spectacular marketing opportunity right on American soil. Kodak had essentially owned the Olympics for decades. It was a standard corporate tradition. The Olympic Organizing Committee approached Kodak to negotiate the official photographic sponsorship. The Kodak executives, entirely arrogant and completely out of touch with the new reality, offered a shockingly low sum of money. They simply assumed the committee had no other choice. They believed the Olympics desperately needed Kodak. Fuji struck immediately. They walked into the committee room and slammed down a massive, undeniable financial offer. They bought the official sponsorship right out from under Kodak. The executives in Rochester watched the news in pure shock. When the 1,984 games began, the entire world watched thousands of athletes compete against a relentless backdrop of bright green Fuji banners. The famous yellow logo of Kodak was completely absent from the biggest global sporting event held in their own country. The psychological impact was absolutely devastating. The green boxes flooded American stores, supported by a massive Olympic advertising campaign. Fuji proved to the world that Kodak was not invincible. They proved the giant could be beaten on its home turf. Fuji used this massive momentum to build a huge manufacturing plant in South Carolina, cementing a permanent physical foothold in America. The invincible empire had officially suffered a massive public defeat. The bleeding had started, and the leadership had absolutely no idea how to stop it. Chapter 6. The Late Struggle. By the late 1990s, the digital wave did not just arrive. It crashed over Rochester like a massive tidal wave. The warnings Steve Sasson delivered 2 decades earlier materialized completely. Consumers stopped buying film. They bought digital devices. Kodak executives could no longer hide behind their chemical walls. Pure panic finally set in across the corporate headquarters. They realized they had to enter the digital camera market immediately or face extinction. But they entered the race years behind their agile, aggressive rivals. Sony, Nikon, and Canon already dominated the retail shelves. Kodak scrambled desperately to catch up. Management mobilized their massive engineering teams and ordered them to build competitive digital cameras. Kodak actually succeeded in building decent hardware. They understood optics. They understood color science. In 2001, they launched the EasyShare line of digital cameras. These devices connected easily to personal computers. They simplified the confusing digital transfer process for ordinary people. The marketing strategy worked perfectly. Consumers recognized the famous yellow logo. They trusted the brand name. They bought the cameras by the millions. By 2005, Kodak achieved something remarkable. They ranked #1 in digital camera sales in the United States. They actually beat Sony. They pushed past Canon. The executives in Rochester celebrated this victory. They truly thought they had successfully navigated the transition. They believed they had saved the empire. They celebrated a complete financial illusion. Winning the hardware market exposed a fatal, unfixable flaw in their structure. Kodak built its massive empire on a very specific business model. They used to sell the physical camera at a cheap price to lock customers into a lifelong cycle of purchasing. Consumers bought film, bought photographic paper, and paid for chemical processing for decades. That recurring revenue generated 70% of their massive corporate profits. The camera was just the bait. The film was the trap. But a digital camera broke the trap completely. A customer bought an EasyShare camera, took 1,000 photos, stored them on a reusable digital memory card, and viewed them instantly on a computer screen. They never bought a single roll of yellow box film. They never paid a laboratory to develop the images. They never bought flash cubes. Every single time Kodak sold a digital camera, they actively destroyed a piece of their own film business. They cannibalized themselves. The executives watched in sheer horror as the recurring revenue streams dried up completely. They moved millions of physical camera units, but the profit margins evaporated into nothing. The digital hardware market operated as a brutal, low-margin environment. Foreign competitors slashed prices relentlessly to gain global market share. Kodak had to match those aggressive price cuts just to stay relevant on the store shelves. They plunged headfirst into a bloody, unsustainable price war. The digital division fought desperately for retail dominance, but the corporate math remained utterly unforgiving. The more digital cameras Kodak sold, the more money the company lost overall. They essentially subsidized their own execution. Meanwhile, the massive factories in Rochester still demanded billions of dollars to operate. The enormous chemical plants, the darkrooms, and the water treatment facilities sat largely idle, but they still cost a fortune to maintain. The building-sized coating machines that once ran 24 hours a day now stood silent and rusting. The massive silver purchasing contracts became heavy financial burdens. Thousands of legacy employees still drew salaries and required expensive pensions. Kodak possessed the heavy, expensive infrastructure of a chemical monopoly, but they were now competing in a lean, fast-paced electronic hardware market. The two realities could not coexist. The company bled cash at an unprecedented, terrifying rate. They won the battle for digital camera sales in America, but the victory felt completely hollow. They realized too late that replacing film with digital sensors did not just change the product, it destroyed the entire economic foundation of the company. The giant was flailing wildly, throwing punches in a dark room, completely unaware that it was bleeding out from a fatal wound it had inflicted upon itself. Kodak proved they could build a digital camera, but they failed to realize that surviving the digital age required building a completely new type of company. And they had absolutely no idea how to do that. Chapter 7. Desperate Decisions. The walls closed in on Rochester. Kodak leadership finally recognized the digital reality, but their minds remained entirely chained to the past. They simply could not imagine a world without printed photographs. People took digital pictures, but the executives firmly believed those consumers still wanted to hold physical paper in their hands. They constructed their entire transition strategy around this single, deeply flawed assumption. They decided to bridge the gap between the new electronic sensors and the old chemical paper. They poured billions of dollars into developing massive digital printing kiosks. They struck aggressive deals with global pharmacy chains and big-box retailers. Suddenly, bright yellow Kodak picture kiosks appeared in thousands of stores across America. The concept seemed logical at first. A customer brought their digital memory card to the store, plugged it into the yellow machine, selected their photos on a touchscreen, and waited for the physical prints to emerge. For a brief period, these machines generated significant cash. People utilized them to print family portraits and holiday snapshots. Kodak executives breathed a massive sigh of relief. They thought they had successfully adapted their business model. They still sold the ink and the specialized paper. But the kiosk strategy entirely missed the fundamental point of digital photography. People did not digitize their images just to print them later. They digitized their images to share them instantly. In 2001, Kodak stumbled upon a golden opportunity. They acquired a rapidly growing tech startup called Ophoto. Ophoto operated as a highly popular online photo-sharing platform. Users uploaded their digital images to the website and shared digital albums with their friends and family. It functioned as an early primitive version of Instagram. Kodak possessed the perfect tool to dominate the future of online visual communication. They owned the social network before social networks truly conquered the internet. However, the executives in Rochester looked at Ophoto and completely misunderstood its value. They did not see a revolutionary communication platform. They saw another machine to drive physical printing. They fundamentally rewired the Ophoto system. Instead of encouraging users to share images freely online, Kodak transformed the website into a digital storefront for physical products. They aggressively pushed users to order physical prints, coffee mugs, and physical photo books. They actively restricted the pure digital sharing features. They took a brilliant tool built for the future and violently hammered it back into the shape of their dying chemical past. They owned the digital network, but they killed its spirit to protect their paper mills. Inside the corporate headquarters, a vicious civil war erupted. The company tore itself apart. On one side stood the traditional film managers. They controlled the legacy infrastructure, the massive factories, and the remaining chemical profits. They fiercely protected their budgets and actively sabotaged the new digital initiatives. On the other side stood the digital advocates. They demanded more funding, faster innovation, and a complete break from the film business. The chief executive officers during this turbulent period attempted to please both factions. They tried to manage a graceful decline of film while simultaneously funding the digital future. This dual strategy failed miserably. By trying to do everything, Kodak achieved nothing. They starved the digital division of necessary capital just to prop up the failing film factories. They reorganized the corporate structure endlessly, shuffling executives from department to department in a desperate attempt to find a magical solution. The endless meetings and internal power struggles paralyzed the company entirely. While Kodak fought itself, the outside world moved at a terrifying speed. Broadband internet spread across the globe. Digital storage became incredibly cheap. People stopped printing photos completely. They emailed them. They uploaded them to new social media platforms that actually understood the digital culture. The yellow kiosks in the pharmacies gathered dust. The O-photo acquisition became a tragic footnote in corporate history. Kodak possessed the talent, the money, and the brand recognition to lead the digital age. But their desperate decisions proved they lacked the courage to abandon their past. They tried to drag their heavy chemical anchor into the new digital ocean, and the massive weight finally began to pull them completely under the surface. Chapter 8. The Freefall. The collapse did not happen gradually. It happened all at once. By the mid-2000s, the consumer film market simply evaporated. The executives in Rochester had modeled a slow, manageable decline spanning decades. Instead, the floor vanished beneath their feet. Global film sales dropped by double-digit percentages every single year. The massive coating machines inside Kodak Park fell silent one by one. The company had built an infrastructure designed to supply the entire planet with chemical film, and suddenly, nobody on Earth wanted it. Kodak desperately clung to their digital camera division, hoping the thin profit margins could somehow sustain the massive corporate weight. Then, in 2007, a man named Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in California and introduced the iPhone. The smartphone did not just change communication. It fundamentally weaponized photography. It placed a high-quality digital lens directly inside a device that consumers already carried in their pockets every single second of the day. Furthermore, it connected that lens directly to the internet. The smartphone delivered the ultimate, fatal blow. People no longer needed to carry a separate piece of hardware just to take a picture. They certainly did not need to plug a camera into a computer to share the image. The smartphone allowed them to capture, edit, and instantly transmit a photograph across the globe with 3 taps of a finger. The standalone consumer digital camera market, Kodak's final, desperate life raft, began to sink rapidly. Sales plummeted. The thin profit margins vanished completely. The financial hemorrhage became impossible to hide. The company bled hundreds of millions of dollars quarter after quarter. The massive cash reserves that had protected the empire for a century finally ran dry. Wall Street analysts stopped asking how Kodak would transition and started asking when Kodak would die. The stock price collapsed, dropping from a historical high of over $90 a share down to single digits. The pride of American industry became a financial toxic asset. To survive the brutal cash crunch, leadership initiated a ruthless campaign of amputation. They fired workers by the thousands. The mass layoffs tore through Rochester like a plague. Generations of families who had depended on the company suddenly found themselves unemployed, stripped of their pensions, and terrified of the future. The city that Kodak built began to rot. The physical dismantling of Kodak Park provided the most visceral image of the collapse. The company simply could not afford to pay the property taxes and maintenance costs for dozens of empty, massive manufacturing buildings. They hired demolition crews to wire the historic structures with explosives. The towering brick chimneys and massive concrete factories that had defined the Rochester skyline for a century came crashing down in clouds of thick gray dust. It was cheaper to destroy the empire than to let it stand empty. Still, the bleeding continued. Kodak needed cash just to make payroll and keep the lights on. They began selling off the healthy organs of the company. They sold their highly profitable health imaging division, the department that made medical scanning machines. They sold their chemical manufacturing branches. They sold everything that held any market value. Eventually, the executives reached the absolute bottom of the barrel. They had nothing left to sell except their ideas. In a final, desperate act of survival, Kodak gathered thousands of their core digital imaging patents. These were the foundational blueprints of digital photography, the direct legacy of Steve Sasson and the early electrical engineers. Kodak placed these sacred patents on the auction block. The ultimate humiliation unfolded publicly. The tech giants of the new era, companies like Apple, Google, and Samsung, circled the dying giant like vultures. They bought the Kodak patents for a fraction of their true value. They stripped the meat from the bones. The company that had invented the digital camera sold the rights to that technology just to buy a few more months of miserable existence. The freefall was complete. Kodak possessed no film market, a dying camera market, no cash, and now no intellectual property. The executives sat in their half-empty headquarters, watching their legacy get dismantled piece by piece. They had spent decades protecting their chemical monopoly, and now they had nothing to show for it except rubble and massive debt. The brilliant engineers who had once designed the future either lost their jobs or watched their life's work auctioned off to foreign competitors. The vibrant, wealthy city of Rochester transformed into a grim warning about the harsh realities of technological disruption. The slide had turned into a vertical drop, and absolutely nothing could stop the final impact. Chapter 9. Death of a Giant. January 2012 arrived without mercy. The Eastman Kodak Company ran out of time, out of assets, and out of cash. For over a century, this corporation had stood as an untouchable pillar of American industrial might. They had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and every economic crisis of the 20th century. But they could not survive their own stubbornness. On the 19th of January, 2012, executives filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a federal court in New York. The unthinkable became reality. The giant officially fell. The bankruptcy filing exposed a massive, terrifying financial crater. The company listed nearly $7 billion in debt. They owed money to thousands of suppliers, vendors, and pension funds. The once overflowing corporate treasury held absolutely nothing. The filing triggered a brutal chain reaction across the global financial markets. The New York Stock Exchange took immediate, cold action. They looked at Kodak, a company that had anchored the prestigious Dow Jones Industrial Average for over 70 years, and wiped it from the board. The exchange officially delisted Kodak stock. Shares that once traded for nearly $100 became entirely worthless overnight. Institutional investors fled in panic. Retail shareholders lost their entire life savings. The corporate death struck Rochester with the force of a natural disaster. The city had tied its entire identity and economic survival to the yellow logo. When the company collapsed, it dragged the community down into the abyss. Tens of thousands of workers had already lost their jobs over the previous decade. Now, the remaining employees faced the ultimate axe. The bankruptcy court allowed the company to slash retiree benefits, gut health insurance plans, and freeze pensions. Elderly men and women who had given 40 years of physical labor to the darkrooms and coding machines suddenly found their lifelines severed. They felt utterly betrayed by the empire they had built with their own hands. The physical footprint of Kodak Park shrank into a massive, terrifying ghost town. The brick buildings stood empty, windows shattered, parking lots overgrown with thick weeds. The private railroad tracks rusted away into the dirt. The company fire department shut its heavy doors. The water treatment plant scaled back entirely. Rochester lost its largest employer, its biggest taxpayer, and its core civic soul. Property values plummeted instantly. Small businesses that relied heavily on factory workers closed their doors permanently. The city government scrambled desperately to fill the massive financial hole left behind, but absolutely nothing could replace the sheer scale of the Kodak economy. The bankruptcy echoed loudly across the global business landscape. It served as a brutal, terrifying warning to every corporate boardroom on Earth. Kodak did not fail because they made bad products. They failed because they refused to adapt to reality. They possessed the smartest engineers, the deepest pockets, and the strongest brand loyalty imaginable. Yet, they allowed a smaller, faster technology to completely destroy them. Chief executive officers across completely different industries stared at the news headlines in pure shock. If a century-old monopoly like Kodak could collapse so completely, nobody was safe. The rules of industrial survival had permanently changed. The filing marked the absolute, definitive end of the chemical film era. The company that had taught the world how to capture light and freeze time now belonged entirely to history. They had democratized photography. They had documented the entire 20th century, but they refused to document the 21st. The digital revolution they had secretly started in a back laboratory in 1975 had finally returned to consume them entirely. The monster they built in the dark finally stepped into the light and devoured its creator. Kodak eventually crawled out of bankruptcy court in late 2013, but it emerged as a fundamentally different entity. It shed its legacy completely. It abandoned the consumer camera market. It abandoned the photographic film market almost entirely. It survived as a drastically smaller, unrecognizable business focused heavily on commercial printing and corporate packaging. The Eastman Kodak Company survived in name only. The consumer empire, the cultural icon, the heavy industrial behemoth that had minted billionaires and defined an entire medium of human expression, died a cold death in the winter of 2012. It left behind a massive void and a chilling lesson about the lethal cost of corporate arrogance. Chapter 10. Tragic Legacy and Lessons Learned. The Eastman Kodak Company still exists today, but it survives only as a ghost. It traded its absolute global dominance for a quiet corner in the commercial printing industry. You no longer see the bright yellow kiosks in pharmacies. People no longer pack yellow boxes of film into their vacation luggage. The brand that once defined human memory now prints packaging materials and specialized chemicals. The transition was brutal, complete, and entirely preventable. The massive, empty spaces in Rochester stand as physical monuments to a colossal failure of imagination. Where tens of thousands of workers once operated building-sized machinery, empty lots and repurposed warehouses now sit quietly. The city survived the blow, but the scars run deep. Generations of families lost their livelihoods because a few executives in corner offices refused to look out the window. What can modern businesses learn from the ashes of Kodak Park? The lessons are harsh, clear, and universally applicable. First, survival requires creative destruction. You must possess the absolute courage to kill your own most profitable product before someone else does it for you. Kodak engineers invented the digital camera. They held the keys to the future. But leadership locked those keys in a vault because they feared losing the massive profits from chemical film. They chose to protect the present at the expense of the future. When you protect an obsolete product, you do not save it. You simply delay your own execution. Second, massive success breeds fatal arrogance. Monopoly power creates a dangerous echo chamber. For a century, Kodak dictated the rules of the market. They told consumers what to buy. They told competitors how to operate. This absolute control convinced them they were invincible. When Fuji attacked their pricing, they responded with lawyers instead of better products. When digital sensors emerged, they dismissed them as toys. They stopped listening to the market because they believed they were the market. Arrogance blinds leadership to shifting realities until it is too late to react. Third, agility always defeats size in a changing landscape. Kodak possessed billions of dollars in cash reserves. They owned the most advanced research laboratories on Earth. They held thousands of foundational patents. By every traditional metric, they should have crushed any digital competitor. But their massive size made them terrifyingly slow. Their corporate bureaucracy choked innovation. They took years to make decisions that required weeks. They tried to fight agile, aggressive tech startups using the heavy, slow machinery of a chemical monopoly. In a technological revolution, speed matters more than deep pockets. Finally, half measures guarantee total failure. When Kodak finally realized they needed to go digital, they refused to commit fully. They tried to build digital cameras that still drove physical printing. They bought a massive photo-sharing website and tried to turn it into a catalog for coffee mugs. They kept one foot firmly planted in their chemical past, while tentatively reaching for the digital future. This dual strategy tore the company apart. You cannot cross a chasm in two small jumps. You either commit entirely to the new reality, or you fall into the void. The story of George Eastman began with a brilliant act of simplification. He looked at a complex, frustrating process and made it accessible to everyone. He built an empire on innovation and relentless forward momentum. The men who inherited his empire forgot his core philosophy. They stopped innovating. They stopped moving forward. They fell in love with their own machinery and forgot the ultimate purpose of their business. No empire lasts forever. No brand holds absolute immunity from disruption. The fall of Kodak remains the ultimate corporate cautionary tale. It proves that past greatness provides absolutely zero protection against future irrelevance. The moment a company stops looking forward, the moment it stops fighting for its own survival, it begins to die. The ruins of Rochester whisper a very clear warning to every modern titan. Adapt entirely, move ruthlessly, or prepare to fall.